Our next panel is called Copts and the Egyptian State, Law, Society, and the Coptic Question. It's going to be moderated by Mark Basta, our Public Affairs and Policy Advisor with Coptic Solidarity. I'll introduce Mark, and he will introduce his co-panelists. Mark is a Public Affairs and Policy Advisor for Coptic Solidarity. He was born and raised in Egypt. He moved to the United States in 2017 with his family. Through his lived experience, Mark focuses on advocating for the equality and safety of Coptic people in Egypt through the UN, US-focused engagement. He previously served as an intern for the International Religious Freedom Religious Freedom Roundtable, and as a fellow for the House of Representatives IRF Caucus Chair's Office. Mark received his Bachelor of Arts from the University of California, Berkeley in 2025 with a focus on political science and public policy. Please join me as we welcome Mark.
Thank you all. Is this working? Can you all hear me? Yeah? Okay, awesome. Well, yeah, I'll try to move this. Okay, is this better? Okay, awesome. Well, thank you, Raed, for the kind introduction, and thank you for joining the panel today titled Copts and the Egyptian State, Law, Society, and the Coptic Question. I'm so honored to moderate this panel and facilitate this timely discussion. I'll give some opening remarks, and then I'll give a chance for each of our panelists to give an opening statement as well, and I'll have some questions for our panel and then individual questions as well. So this panel approaches the historical Coptic question and brings some contemporary understanding to the relationship between Copts and the Egyptian state. Coptic issues are often treated as a purely religious issue and one to be managed through a national unity framework. But Coptic issues go much broader than just a sectarian wave. They are about law, citizenship, representation, and equality issues. Today's panel brings three perspectives that give a holistic view of this topic. We have the US policy view to analyze state behavior top-down, an academic perspective, and an advocacy one to investigate the different stakes affecting the Coptic question. My hope is that this discussion helps us move beyond viewing Coptic struggles as a mere religious disagreement or conflict and towards a more nuanced evaluation of whether Copts enjoy equal citizenship and equal legal and social rights in Egypt. So I'll first introduce our speakers. I'll introduce them in order from right to left. So Dr. Mona Oraby is a scholar of comparative law, religion, and politics, and an associate professor of political science at Howard University. She's the author of Devotion to the Administrative State, Religion, and Social Order in Egypt, a study of Baha'i and Coptic claims-making that examines religious minorities' counterintuitive desire for religion-state entanglement. Her publications have appeared in Law and Society Review, Annual Review of Law and Social Science, and Journal of Law and Religion, among other venues. She serves on the editorial boards of Arab Law Quarterly and Middle East Law and Governance, and has held fellowships at NYU Abu Dhabi, the Max Planck Institute, and the American Bar Foundation. Our next speaker is going to be Raed Jarrar. Raed is an Arab American political advocate based in Washington, D.C. He's the advocacy director for Democracy for the Arab World Now, DAWN. Since immigrating to the U.S. in 2005, he has worked as a lobbyist on political issues pertaining to the U.S. engagement in the Arab world. Widely recognized as an expert on political, social, and economic developments in the MENA region, he has testified in numerous congressional hearings and briefings. He is a frequent guest on national and international media outlets in Arabic and English, including CNN, NPR, and Al Jazeera. He has been published in the New York Times and quoted in media outlets including The Washington Post, Newsweek, and more. Raed was raised in countries all across the Middle East. He received his bachelor's degree from the University of Baghdad and his master's from the University of Jordan, both in architectural engineering. And last but not least, Mr. David Schenker. Did I spell that right? Okay. Mr. David is a senior fellow and director of the program on Arab politics at the Washington Institute. And this just ran out of my face. Sorry, guys. Confirmed by the Senate in June 2019, he served as Assistant Secretary of State for Near Eastern Affairs through January 2021. From 2002 to 2006, Mr. Schenker served in the office of the Secretary of Defense as Levant Country Director, the Pentagon's top policy aide on the Arab countries of the Levant. In that capacity, he was responsible for advising the Secretary and other senior Pentagon leadership on the military and political affairs of Syria, Lebanon, Jordan, and the Palestinian territories. He was awarded the Office of the Secretary of Defense Medal for Exceptional Civilian Service in 2005. Like I said, this panel is very diverse and it brings very holistic view of our topic at hand. And I want to begin with the framing of the panel and give a chance for each of our speakers to share more on their thoughts. And, starting with kind of an opening note, when we say, talking about the Coptic question, what are we really talking about today? Is it primarily a question of religion, religious freedom, equal citizenship, minority rights, or something completely different? What do you think is most understood about it? And so with that, I'll hand it to Dr. Oraby.
Should I answer the question or be thinking about it?
I think this is a question as like a long-term objective of the panel.
Okay,
Yes.
great, thank you. Good afternoon. Thank you to Coptic Solidarity for the invitation to join today's conversation. Thank you, Mark, for the kind introduction. As a scholar of comparative law and religion, my research has focused on the legal status of non-Muslims in Muslim-majority Egypt. I'm interested not only in the administrative law and procedures created by the state to regulate religious difference. I also examine how communities marginalized by those structures engage with the state. This dual focus has led me to some important findings that remain relevant today. When I speak about my interlocutors in the comments that follow, I use pseudonyms to protect their identity. Baha'i and Coptic Christians in the early 20th century stand at the forefront of legal claims making against the Egyptian state. Yet they do not mobilize to deregulate religious difference in administrative law. In Egypt, religion is a compulsory category on every civil document, with the exception of passports, from birth to death. Rather than seek to remove religious affiliation from state probative documents or its privileged position and how civil status is determined, members of religious minority groups fight instead to situate Baha'i and Coptic difference within the religious and legal landscape recognized by the nation state. They do so with the ultimate aim to expand existing definitions of law and religion in ways that include their difference and, as I find, reinforce majoritarianism. My research, which draws on over 50 years of administrative jurisprudence, participant observation, and semi-structured interviews, began over a decade ago. It has culminated in a book published by Princeton University Press in the year 2024 entitled Devotion to the Administrative State, Religion and Social Order in Egypt. This research began in Greater Cairo with Baha'is, but quickly expanded, shedding its single community focus. I learned from lawyers that since the mid-1990s, thousands of petitions had been filed by individuals whose requests to amend their religious affiliation on vital records had been denied by the Interior Ministry. Baha'is weren't the only ones suing the Egyptian government. Petitioners included born Muslim converts to Coptic Orthodoxy, known as Mutanassirun, born Coptic converts to Islam, known simply as Muslims, reconverts to Coptic Orthodoxy, Aidun lil-Masihiyya, and the children of reconverts to Coptic Orthodoxy, or Awlad al-Aidun. As I collected and analyzed petitions and judicial decisions and observed lawyers' work, I came to understand that these disputes concerned the right to identification. Petitioners claimed that the government had failed to recognize their true religious affiliation. They crafted elaborate arguments affirming that religious difference is essential to their civil identity and demanded that their government acknowledge this. Remarkably, in all cases, this claim was a request for subsidiary civil status. Since 1980, the Egyptian constitution has designated Islamic law the principal source of legislation, which in practice has meant that non-Muslims face routine discrimination in public and private sector employment, eligibility for political office, entitlement to state allowances, marriage authorization, child custody decisions, admission to primary and secondary schools and universities, and eligibility to sit for certain exams, which affects entire work trajectories, housing opportunities, and so on. Petitioners who sought to align their self-proclaimed and official religious affiliations could either convert or remain Muslim, but routinely chose not to. My interlocutors went to great lengths and incurred substantial costs, financial and social, to align their self-proclaimed and official religious affiliation through state legal procedures. They conveyed deeply affective attachments to the objects that substantiated their legal personhood, namely national ID cards, but birth and marriage certificates as well. Whatever their generational location, class background, or level of education, they did not fully recognize themselves as Christians or Baha'is or as belonging to a religious community until and unless the nation-state identified them as such. Moreover, rather than advocate for indifference toward religion, they sought inclusion within the Egyptian Republic, not as Muslims, but as Islam's others. Those seemingly marginalized by the state were among its most devoted subjects. This fidelity was puzzling in light of the revolutionary situation in Egypt at that time. Despite documented accounts of ongoing discrimination experienced by non-Muslims at the hands of the state, no grassroots campaign to remove religion from Egyptian national ID cards has gained a mainstream following or resulted in policy change. I'm happy to discuss the Baha'i case at length in the Q&A, or at greater length in the Q&A. But ostensibly, no significant policy change has occurred regarding the Egyptian national ID cards and the requirement to indicate religious affiliation on those documents. No legislative momentum has developed around the issue. My interlocutors never championed these initiatives, although they face routine discrimination in housing, employment, education, marriage, inheritance, and divorce on the basis of their religion. And their devotion to the administrative state did not ebb after August 14th, 2013, when Egyptian state police and the army undertook one of the world's largest mass killings in a single day. They held in one palm the knowledge of state brutality, and in the other, a desire for state recognition, as did millions of others. In the years 2011 to 2013, protesters held the Interior Ministry to account for many injustices. But the ministry's civil administrative function, right, its accounting of who Egyptians are relative to their belonging in a religious community, has survived each convulsion. It was hardly a target. So, how do we explain minorities' desire for recognition from a state that marginalizes them? How do we explain minorities' desire for recognition from a state that marginalizes them? To answer this question, I treat both the Egyptian state and the Coptic Orthodox Church as member-based regulatory organizations with at times complementary authority, when their authority collides, when it clashes. This conflict is less about the nation-state's encroachment on religious life than how belonging in multiple exclusive communities is determined. The Coptic Church enjoys standing in Egyptian law as an administrative body. This means that it is empowered to make decisions transformative of civil status. Take marriage. Today, there is no civil marriage option in Egypt for two Egyptian citizens wishing to marry. The Egyptian Republic will only recognize a marriage between two Copts when the Coptic Church says that the two parties are, in fact, married. The marriage certificate held by Egyptian Copts, issued by the Interior Ministry, thus reflect the Republic's recognition of the Church's authority to unite two persons in matrimony. The ministry-issued certificates are provided once the newlyweds present evidence from the Church, a Church-issued marriage certificate of the institution having officiated their union. When Egyptian Copts, following divorce, sue the Coptic Church for refusing to issue authorizations for remarriage, they do so in administrative court, not personal status court. The Coptic Church thus holds public power. Its actions are subject to the oversight of the administrative judiciary, whose mandate is to guard against abuses of precisely this type of power. Conceptualizing the Coptic Church and the Egyptian Republic as member-based organizations with at times overlapping public authority allows us to account for the counterintuitive preference of non-Muslims to retain subsidiary status in a Muslim majoritarian context. By foregrounding the state's administrative functions, we see that non-Muslims are not actually acting counterintuitively. What marginalized religious communities are doing when they lodge claims for recognition is assenting to the regulatory capacity of the Republic and their communal organizations. One of the first attorneys I met in Cairo counseled Baha'i complainants before a well-known research and legal advocacy organization was retained as their primary counsel, who I'm calling Ayub Ramez, welcomed me into his office after hours when the legal secretaries had gone home and I was free to chat. He had risen to fame not through civil rights litigation, but through entertainment law. He was attorney to the stars. Ayub's gold cufflinks caught the dim office light as he mapped out on an invisible board how these cases came to pass. A buzzing air conditioner made his tailored suit seem sensible in August. I wanted to know why he had taken on the Baha'i cases, why he hadn't used his political and legal clout to help deregulate religion in administrative law, effectively removing the religion category from civil status. It seemed to me at the time, and this was very early in my research, that the thorny bureaucratic disputes he and other attorneys negotiated could be nullified once amendment to religious affiliation was no longer a justiciable claim. Wouldn't removing the religion box from ID cards solve the issue? I asked. It was a naive question. How will we know who we are? He countered. هنعرف نفسنا إزاي? Ayub was concerned that if Baha'is were not properly accounted for, Coptic women would marry out of the denomination more easily. When one of our women goes to marry, he said, and religion is no longer on the ID card, who's to say she won't marry a Baha'i? Here was an attorney who asserted a Coptic identity and advocated for the recognition of Baha'i difference in order to ensure the continuity of Coptic orthodoxy, whose future he located in marriage understood as an exclusively intra-denominational sacrament. In other words, a member of one marginalized group was advocating for members of another marginalized group so that each group could remain distinct and coherent. While observers read public and jurisprudential debates on recognition through the lens of freedom and equality, equality is not necessarily what is at issue or what is at stake in these disputes. When individuals and groups entrust their states to work well or better, as my Baha'i and Coptic interlocutors do, they assent, they agree and support to deep-seated inequality. Let's return to Ayub's response. The first and second we in the question, how will we know who we are, is the collective, right? It is Copts, present, past, and future, changed over time, yet recognizable to itself. This frame for understanding the stakes of recognition coheres or aligns with what I saw, read, and heard during my research. I found that migration between categories of religious difference is a practice overseen by Copts like Ayub. They know well that communal coherence requires distinguishing Coptic orthodoxy from other normative orders and their collectives, including other Christian denominations and their members. Some borrowing across traditions is also entailed in this work. But it would be a mistake to attribute this work to lawyers alone. They travel in circuits, the attorneys and their clients, a microcosm of Egyptian society, each person and group distinguishing themselves from others. The work that Coptic lawyers do to shape administrative law and jurisprudence includes aligning with the official church position on what constitutes membership in the denomination. It also aims to reassert what they perceive as a necessary legal distinction between Christians and Muslims that their clients subvert when converting to Islam. One such lawyer, Fadi Ibrahim, a man I'm naming Fadi Ibrahim, put it to me this way. Honor and generosity in Egypt are a high rank, martaba ulya, and religion is higher than this rank. The girl who becomes Muslim, التي تؤسلم, is forsaken, tunbaz, by her family. And the girl who becomes Christian, التي تتنصر, is forsaken by her family. And so religious conversion is strange, غير معروف, in Egypt. These lawyers are highly suspicious of their clients' motivations for leaving Coptic orthodoxy and not at all averse to state regulation. Some of them communicated a preference for concealing the religion designation on certain probative documents, namely the national ID card, but all agreed that this information was necessary and should be collected by the state. The ethics that underlie lawyers' advocacy, the decisions they make about which claims to advance, whom to represent, and how best to negotiate bureaucratic obstinacy illumine why some memberships overlap, Christian and Egyptian, Muslim and Egyptian, Baha'i and Egyptian, while other memberships remain distinct and exclusive, Baha'i, not Copt, Copt, not Muslim, Muslim, not Copt, Copt, not Baha'i. Scholars have rightly observed that the religious lives of Egyptian Christians and Muslims today are largely carried out in entirely separate and distinct spheres, but I challenge the assertion that these spheres are by governmental design. Instead, my interlocutors, many of whom identify proudly as Copts, are ordinary people who, while seeking to resolve mundane administrative issues, ensure that Christians and Muslims and Baha'is remain distinct groups by law. So in closing, the year 2026 marks 15 years since the Egyptian uprising of 2011. As we consider prospects for expanded citizenship in the years ahead, I urge us to consider why regulatory regimes that systematically marginalize non-Muslims remain largely unchanged. We ought to consider what state-mandated religious affiliation makes possible and ensures. Focusing only on top-down governance overlooks the myriad ways that minorities affirm state authority. Thank you.
Dr. Oraby, Raed,
Hello, everyone. My name is Raed Jarrar. I am Dawn's Advocacy Director based here in Washington, D.C. Thank you for inviting me. Thank you for the remarks from Dr. Oraby. It's hard to follow, but I will try. I would say, I will start with something that resonated with me with what Dr. Oraby was mentioning about how she started her research as a singular, on a singular religious group, and it expanded. And that is something that my organization has looked into in Egypt and other parts of the region over and over again. Because the Coptic question is a legitimate question. And it also falls within the larger Egyptian question. The same marginalization that Coptic Egyptians deal with, it's not separate from other religious groups in Egypt. And of course, that's not said to minimize any of the experiences of Coptic Egyptians, but to try to dig deeper at the root cause of what should be handled. From our perspective as a U.S. organization that monitors the region, there is an authoritarian regime in Egypt that jails Muslim and Christian and Coptic and other minorities in the same method, the same regime that jailed Ala Abdel Fattah, one of the very high-profile cases from Egypt, also jails Patrick Zeki, a Coptic activist, many other Coptics in Egypt. So we find very similar or parallel realities where Coptics in this room are much more free to express themselves and criticize the Egyptian government than Coptics in Egypt. And of course, it's paralleled with other minorities or people from the mainstream Arab or Muslim backgrounds in the country. So the main point that I'm driving here is that Coptic marginalization is definitely a symptom of an authoritarian regime. And that authoritarian regime is the disease that many different people try to address and expose and use our leverage upon from the US. One of the issues that are more relevant to our meeting here is that Sisi was framed as a protector after he came into power, a protector to the minorities in Egypt. And that wasn't just the case in Egypt. We saw similar rhetoric come from other countries in the region, including in Syria. Former Syrian dictator Bashar al-Assad also showed himself or tried to promote himself as a protector of Christians and other minorities in the country. It's a theme that is repeated along the region by authoritarian regimes, and it is very effective because it goes a long way here in DC. The framing, although is performative, it's received very warmly in DC because the issue is of sectarian violence and attacks against Christians in the region is of top interest. And unfortunately, the protection is like very symbolic, and in most cases, the structural discrimination in the law is not addressed or seen by Congress. That's why I think having your work is important in trying to dig deeper than just a photo op or a few talking points regarding, the situation of Copts or other Egyptians in Egypt, that it actually goes into much more complex structural legal issues that need to be addressed by the state, and the United States has a lot of leverage to address. So I would say from our perspective, the US has different venues of leverage that it could but does not really use to push the Egyptian government for reforms or change of policy. The most obvious one is the $1.3 billion of foreign military financing that the United States gives to Egypt. The US has been giving Egypt this for decades and decades. People don't even know why. It's literally a policy on autopilot. It was put in place in the 1970s, and it's just going on. The rationale behind the policy back in the 1970s was to give Israel and Egypt reasons to not attack each other. I don't think many people in 2026 think that Egypt and Israel are going to go to war anytime soon, or that the $1.3 billion that we give to Egypt has any sort of leverage to reduce war breaking out between Israel and Egypt. Keep in mind that this is a massive number because Egypt is the third largest recipient of U.S. military foreign military financing or U.S. tax dollars in the world, followed by Israel and Jordan. It's a huge amount of money. It is usually used for weapons that Egypt doesn't really need. It's actually a very funny expose if you look at the details of where the money goes. A lot of the money goes to buying tanks that Egypt doesn't need and doesn't want, but it is connected to corruption from both the Egyptian and U.S. governments, like what we call the military-industrial complex. Some of these weapons that, even in some cases here in the U.S., some of the weapons that we produce, the Pentagon, the U.S.-owned Department of Defense, tells the government, we don't need them anymore. And the government continues to produce them. Like one example that I always give is the A-10 airplane. It's this really old airplane. Hasn't really been effective for a few decades. And every year the Pentagon comes back to Congress and says, we don't need this thing. We actually don't need it. But the A-10 manufacturers have managed to, it's a small airplane. It's a little bit bigger than a car, honestly. Like it's an anti-personnel airplane. The manufacturing of the airplane is distributed all around the United States. Like one state makes the door, one state makes the wheel, one state makes a small, mirror, whatever. So whenever there are threats to cut the A-10 program, the Senate gets phone calls from all 50 states. Members of Congress get phone calls from all 50 states. I'm going to lose my job. I'm going to lose my job. It has nothing to do with Egypt. It has nothing to do with war. It doesn't have to do with anything. And then the A-10 stays. And the $1.3 billion, unlike public imagination that this is money going to support Egypt's military, it's actually a bunch of weapons that Egypt will never use, including outdated tanks that Egypt has way more than what it can use. It will never actually use it. It's stuck in that cycle. Part of it is corruption. A part of it is, not messing with the status quo. And that's a point that is very important for us to see. The status quo is not just going on because no one is protecting it. There are millions and billions of dollars that have been spent to maintain the status quo. Egypt has spent millions of dollars on special interest lobbyists in DC to make sure that whatever measures of accountability that we push from here are not included. I mean, last year you also saw that there was a scandal involving Egypt giving bribes to members of Congress as well. Some of them were indicted. The criminal indictments, we have called for an investigation on not only the ones who got indicted, but other members of Congress who maintained very cozy relationships with Sisi government over the years to ask questions. I mean, honestly, looking at the details of how much money and how the money was given to the indicted members of Congress, it doesn't seem like a one-off. It seems like they've been doing that for a while, and they're very relaxed doing it. So corruption is a part of it, and we haven't really been able to utilize U.S. pressure on this $1.3 billion. Historically, we managed to add a little bit of pressure by saying $1 billion of this money goes to Egypt with no questions asked, and the other $300 million will go with some questions asked. So it was conditioned. The $300 million were conditioned on some benchmarks. So every year we'll talk to Congress, we'll say, can you please add reforming administrative law for marriage in Egypt as one of the benchmarks that we want Egypt to meet before we give them another $1.3 billion. Unfortunately, Congress also has a waiver where every year they come back and they say, Egypt hasn't met any of the demands. They're actually still committing gross violations of human rights. They're doing this and that. But we're going to invoke this national security waiver and we're going to give them all the money. So more recently, we've been pushing for exclusion of some of that money from the national security waiver. So even like a smaller portion, small steps of like pushing for reform. But our weapons are, our like tools in our toolbox are very limited when it comes to pushing for reform from DC. I would say other systems of reform that we have used throughout the years include Section 502B of the Foreign Assistance Act, which requires like a Secretary of State tools to condition aid based on human rights as well. That has never been invoked in Egypt. It's very difficult to have. This year's National Defense Authorization Act also included some sort of language to include, to have conditionality on Egypt. So I'm just giving some examples of how we can and we should tell our own government here in the US that violations that happen in Egypt are not happening in a vacuum. We're not just audiences to foreign violations happening. We are participants. We're funding many of these actions with our tax dollars through the foreign military financing programs. We're also supporting them politically through our legitimizing the government's actions through connections. So there is a lot of leverage that could be exerted from this side. I would say, like, I'm going to give a couple of examples of things that we can do from an advocacy perspective, and then maybe we can engage on more details in the questions and answers. Because the premise here is that, stability built on exclusions and corruption is just a deferred crisis. Like, we have to realize that it's not really about the lack of violence in the here and now. It is about reaching to permanent solutions. So coming up with more specific asks that experts in Egypt can come up with could be attached to either the National Defense Authorization Act of 2027 or next year. And these things take a long time, conversations with Congress to try to add some of the conditions there. Can also be added by meeting directly with the State Department to designate Egypt as a country of particular concern under the International Religious Freedom Act. And that creates additional executive leverage from the United States, not from Congress, but from the executive branch, from the State Department. And Egypt cares about this. Egypt is very sensitive to criticism that comes from the US. So just upgrading the status of Egypt with the State Department's criterias will actually create that space for a dialogue where the Egyptian government will come and say, what do you want us to do to get off the wall of shame? So that's an important leverage to be put there. And the last thing I want to say is working with the Foreign Affairs Committee, which many of our organizations have done over the years, to push for 502B implementation on Egypt, including holding a hearing that will address some of the issues that come up in our conference here every year. List that on the agenda as issues of concern that the U.S. Congress wants Egypt addressed. I'm going to stop here, but I can add a little bit more points in the question and answer. Thank you.
Good afternoon. Can you hear me? Can you hear me? Well, it's a pleasure being with you today and talking about these important issues. You know, it wasn't long ago that President Trump described President Sisi as his favorite dictator. Now, I think that, you know, in the years since then, he has been replaced by Erdogan in Turkey. But I think this tells you the mindset. And these days, if you look at the agenda of the administration, you know, we have a foreign war that's pretty big and all absorbing of attention economically, et cetera. But before this, it was immigration to the United States, ICE, you know, deportations. There really is very little bandwidth for the type of traditional foreign policy that the United States has pursued, looking at bilateral relations, having problems with certain countries, coming back and engaging with these countries. In terms of Egypt, it's largely peripheral. Part of that is Egypt's fault, right? President Sisi has sort of bankrupted the country, right? It's now 50% of the annual budget is spent on debt servicing. Has no economic strength, but it has no political strength, really, very, very little, right? It's not what it was in the days of Gamal Abdel Nasser. So we're interested periodically in Egypt when it comes to Gaza or other issues related to Israel, not particularly interested on issues like the GERD and things like this. And of course, human rights are a very low priority for the Trump administration. I can't emphasize that enough, save for one element of human rights, which is religious freedom. And I'll get back to that in a second. The Copts, as you know, still face, you know, enormous structural social discrimination. But from where this administration stands, they'll look at it and say in 2025, 2026, the community has not been targeted with the type of egregious sectarian violence that we have seen over the years. You know, what Raed talked about, you know, that outwardly the President Sisi is an ally of the community, right? He attended Christmas Mass. He sends Easter and Christmas greetings. He, you know, made Christmas, Eastern Christmas a national holiday in Egypt. These things are great, you know, and he was viewed, I think, you know, along the lines of this symbolic thing, authoritarian, better than Muslim brother, right, better than Islamists. And it's not only, you know, initially the community embracing Sisi, right, rather than the Muslim brother. This happened in Syria too. The community actually embraced Basta, the Christian community there, for years. You know, you've taken other steps, I think, that have been positive and that the U.S. government would think are relatively positive in terms of loosening some of the restrictions on renovating churches, on building churches, on doing the bureaucracy around churches. You know, 3,700 unregistered churches became eligible to be registered. The United States government looks at these things. You know, I think 3,100 or something have been now registered. But as to, you know, Dr. Mona's points, you still have these ruthless blasphemy laws that are used largely, I think, to attack Coptic Christians in the state. And there's people languishing for years in jail because of this. You know, you have also the social media laws, what I call the morality laws, right, which have largely affected the Christian community in Egypt as well. So there still is, of course, the employment discrimination, but the administration is not particularly interested in this in Egypt. And in fact, you know, the Trump administration has made, I think, a clear point in its commitment to defending religious liberties, and particularly to defending Christians. You know, they have this Religious Liberty Commission, a task force to eradicate anti-Christian bias, but all of these efforts in practice have been focused on domestic policy in the United States, not looking at the treatment of Christians abroad. You know, the administration has done one thing, I think, on behalf of Christians internationally, right? Or allegedly. This is Boko Haram in Nigeria. The intervention there, you know, authorized tomahawk strikes in the name of halting Christian genocide. Now, I'm not familiar enough with the issue to tell you whether it was actually, you know, a genocide, whether it was just gross human rights abuse, a community targeted. But outside of that, you know, the administration is largely focused on domestic persecution or perceived persecution in the United States of Christians, people being not appointed for positions or prejudice or trying to expand the space for faith and public life. And in fact, the administration's previous nominee for ambassador at large for religious freedom was never brought to a vote. The nomination expired, leaving the position vacant. And the rest of the State Department's Office for Religious Freedom has been unstaffed. In fact, if you go back to 2005, anyone remember Elon Musk? Right? They dozed basically the whole office out of existence. You go up on the State Department website and look for their annual report on religious freedom, right? They don't have one since 2023. Right? Now, I understand they prepared a report for 24. We're going to release it in 25. And everyone got dozed, and they couldn't review the document. And the administration, while it is, I believe, and Raed, maybe you can tell me, it's congressionally mandated that the State Department release a report. They don't really have much regard for Congress in the administration. You know, you had on June 1st, the White House released a message on Global Copt Day. You know, that was very nice and flowery. But it made no mention in the statement from the White House to the Coptic community of Egypt. Right? It's stunning, really. Nor has the administration implemented the international, the Commission on International Religious Freedom's recommendation that Raed talked about in his talk, which was that the recommendation that Egypt be added to the list, the special watch list for engaging in or tolerating severe violations of religious freedom. That has not been moved. Now, Congress is working on a couple things. I think French Hill has a piece of legislation expressing concern. This is sort of the name and shame that often works or gets Egypt's attention at a minimum. The administration, the Commission on Religious Freedom actually had a handful of recommendations. One was to put them on the watch list. The other, and this is sort of simple stuff, but that the State Department and the White House, when they engage with Egypt, should bring up human rights, should bring up religious freedoms, should bring up, certain articles of the criminal code that should go, to put this into, the security cooperation, that this should be an element to this, releasing prisoners of conscience, travel bans, religious dissidents, other embassy activities, and then it has some things that Congress should do as part of this U.S. CIRF recommendations. I want to differ, though, from Raed on the issue of aid to Egypt. Because I think, this is a committed dictatorship, a committed authoritarian regime. When the United States first gave Egypt FMF and ESF, economic support funds and foreign military financing back in like 1979, it was $2 billion a year, 3 to Israel, 2 to Egypt on the signing of Camp David. That was an enormous portion of Egypt's GDP at the time, right? The 1.3 today is almost nothing, right? Egypt could do without it. And in fact, as many of you know, 4 years ago, Egypt was like the 4th largest arms purchaser in the world, right? This is with national funds, right? Not with U.S. funds, right? They bought 4 submarines. For what enemy, right? They bought a French marine amphibious landing vehicle for helicopters to use against what, right? And they still have all these tanks and all equipment from all over the world. I think what the 1.3 billion was supposed to do is keep Egypt in the pro-Western camp, as Egypt hedges, right? They would say goodbye to the $1.3 billion. I think it doesn't have nearly the type of leverage that we want, and the type of leverage that we use is not to buy advanced Russian fighter jets or deal more with the Chinese and certain types of technology. But we should be calling out Egypt. And I think that this is not going to happen during this administration, regrettably. But I think at the same time, it would be useful for your community to be working on the administration to get these bureaucratic arms active again in the United States, putting out the reports, naming and shaming, talking about the condition of the community, and working on Congress, because I think Congress actually is interested in this issue a whole lot more than the administration is. So thank you.
There you go. Thank you so much. I really appreciate all of our panelists today. I think this was immensely insightful, and I think the diversity in the speakers really has served the biggest purpose of showing and kind of trying to move beyond and understand the different stakes of the Coptic question. And it goes beyond just thematic frameworks. It goes beyond just a religious freedom or an administrative or a political issue. I think it also transcends geography, and we kind of see that today. The Coptic community today is not in the same geographical concentration as it was 100 years ago. The Coptic diaspora is in the millions around the world. And in some way, the Coptic question is a transnational question now, and not just something that is related to Egypt. And I really appreciate our panelists bringing that perspective in today as well, talking about U.S. involvement and U.S. role and all of that. And so I'll move to a question kind of for all of our panelists before giving individual questions. And this kind of relates to the title of the panel. Egypt's constitution and official narrative often speak in the language of equality, national unity, religious freedom, that everything is basically okay. Many Coptic grievances kind of concern the gap between formal commitments and the lived experience. How should we understand that gap between law on paper or in speeches and the lived experiences or the reality of Coptic life and Coptic interaction with the state? And we can go, I think, in the same order.
May I ask you to repeat the question?
Yes.
So that I've understood it, please.
Yes. Let me read it down. So Egypt's constitution and official narrative often speak in the language of equality, religious freedom, national unity, that these are existing facts. and that we're way past the times of sectarianism, which is how the Coptic issue is usually framed as exclusively. But many Coptic grievances are usually come between that gap between the law and the reality. For example, church construction laws that show that we've technically solved all the problems with regulations, but there are still churches that get held up, and there is still a lot of selective application of certain laws on Copts. And that's just to name one example. So how should we understand this gap between the official discourse and the lived experiences?
Thank you so much for that question. I think I have two ways of responding. One is, so in my study of administrative jurisprudence over a span of over 50 years, I find...
Oh.
It is on, but it is far.
you can hear me now? No.
Yeah, those mics are kind of...
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Great. Okay, so I would suggest two responses to the question. So in my years of studying administrative jurisprudence in Egypt and also contending with constitutional language, which inevitably does come up, it is invoked in administrative petitions. I think one thing that is important to remember is the significance of what we might call the order of revelation in organizing Egyptian society and Egyptian law. Right? According to the order of revelation, Judaism is preceded by Christianity, and Christianity is preceded by Islam. And this ordering of Egyptian society is not only commemorated in the Constitution, but informs Egyptian law and policy, right? Which helps us understand why, for many decades, Baha'i Egyptians have fallen completely outside state protection. Baha'i Egyptians have no place in the narrative of the Egyptian nation, which is rooted significantly in this order of revelation, right? In the eyes of the Egyptian state, Baha'i Egyptians do not have a religion, they have an ideology, right? The other way to answer your question, you name the gap between formal language and everyday practice. I like to think about this gap in terms of the legal scholarship, right? So constitutional law and debate tends to draw most of our attention, right? When we want to think about what is the status of a particular group or people or particular issue, we think first about a constitutional question. But legal scholars have shown that constitutions globally largely resemble each other, right? And that is because constitutions are mostly written for the international community. Where the rubber hits the road for constitutionalism is in the administrative practices, right? So if we want to measure the protections, if we want to measure whether constitutional freedoms and protections are actually adhered to in law and policy, we often need to look in ordinary, mundane domains of practice. In the United States, that would be places like the DMV, right? So where ordinary Egyptians or ordinary people actively engage with the state. Most people around the world are not facing or do not prompt constitutional questions. They are primarily engaged in the state in such a way that they are contending with the administrative apparatus of that state.
Thank you. Would you like me to repeat?
Yeah.
Yeah. So the question is about the kind of the gap between the Constitution, the public narrative on religious freedom, national unity, how that's encouraged and promoted, and the lived experiences of Copts, and how do we evaluate and essentially reconcile that?
Yeah, I mean, I don't don't have expertise to answer the question from the detailed question about lived experience of Egyptians and Copts. But I would say from the narrative that we have in Washington, D.C., D.C. looks at Egypt and thinks about issues of religious freedom as symbolic and issues that could be addressed through grand gestures, like visiting a church on Christmas or making a religious holiday like a national holiday. But there is absolutely no knowledge or interest, I would say, from a lot of the decision makers in DC into even asking that question. So throughout my years working on Egyptian issues, it's one talking point that is used, maybe to vilify one government and make another government look better, maybe to justify some policy making to say Christians like this and Muslims don't like this. But that question is not really addressed in DC. And I think that is an issue that has a lot of value and should be brought to Congress as an important issue to examine, to interrogate, while talking to the Egyptians, but also while legislating U.S. foreign policy in Egypt.
This is totally absent from the view from Washington. This is the details of what the state. Is that good? Better. Yeah, this is not an issue that that any lawmaker or anybody at the White House is going to be looking at. This is traditionally the stuff of diplomats, right? To look at, the institutional, prejudice against non-Muslims in Egypt. Sometimes administrations look at these issues and care about them deeply. But it requires, a sort of level of not only interest but expertise to care about. I think this administration looks at it and sees what they saw from very early on, that this was the opposite of the Muslim Brotherhood, that this was a return to traditional, more palatable Egyptian politics, that this is the eternal Egypt, which has, this 6,000-year-old bureaucracy that cannot be fixed ever by anyone. And likely it's not an intentional part of the system. I think that is the general view from Washington, that it's regrettable, but this isn't, I tend to disagree with that view. I think that this is a state that declares itself that it is an Arab Muslim country. And certainly wasn't the case 100 years ago, right? It's increasingly, regrettably, the case. And this is just not an agenda item that this administration will focus on. But I think you got to keep on chipping away, because the state will present itself as a country for all Egyptians. And I think we all know that's just not necessarily the case.
Yeah. Thank you. I with the last bit of time we have left, I don't want to be the only person speaking, so I'll maybe open it for questions if anyone has questions for the panelists, and then if we have any time left, I'll ask my questions. But yes, okay, so we don't have time for my questions. But yeah, we can go with Mr. Ahmed and then Bishoy.
For the example that Dr. Oraby said about if you go to the DMV and no matter what color you are, what nationality, so long you have an ID and you move from one state to another, within 6 months you present the photo ID and a utility bill to show your address, and automatically you have a new ID. For the religion status, they say in Egypt that they will have only 3 religions. I don't want the religion to be a drop-down menu. It's just you have to select out of the 3. Egyptian, if they would like to maintain the religion, the religious status as one of the name and date of birth and sex, I don't mind it. But they should be able to write whatever religion you want, and that should be written on your ID. They write right now Muslim, and what type of Muslim, Sunni or Shia? Because they actually kill each other and they don't intermarry between each other. So I would like to see them, just whatever is a Maronite, they must write Maronite, and that should be the law. It's not for the clerk to interpret your religion. That's my opinion, and we should demand that.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Appreciate it. Yeah, Bishoy.
All right, this is a question for Dr. Oraby as well. So let's assume that the Christian minority of Egypt gradually abandoned their emphasis on distinction, right?
I'm sorry, could you restate the beginning?
Okay, let's assume that the Christian minority of Egypt gradually abandoned their emphasis on distinction, like they don't request the law to distinguish between them and Baha'i and Muslims. All right? How would they overcome the Sharia law that's impeded in Egyptian constitution, Egyptian law, and the society itself, the social norms? I give you an example. So I am going to declare myself as just Egyptian. I don't need any distinction between me and any other Egyptian. But the law, according to its principle of Sharia, because the law is based on the principles of the Sharia law, does not allow me to marry a Muslim woman. And a Muslim woman is not allowed to marry a Christian man. A Muslim man and a Muslim woman cannot convert to Christianity. Is it clear, or should I?
So what is the question?
How would they overcome this impeded obstacle, which is Sharia law? So I am going to identify myself not requesting any kind of distinction between me and other Egyptians. But by doing this, I'm going to face another obstacle, which is bigger. The law, the Egyptian law, based on Sharia law, the law will not allow me to be this way. If the Christians of Egypt stopped, or they would be completely overwhelmed or overtaken by the majority. Thank you. Thank you.
So I think maybe if please correct me if I'm wrong, but I think the question was referring, in the case that, in the ideal case that we take out the religious identification from national ID, with the continuation of Sharia law being the primary source of legislation, how do we ensure that taking out religion isn't just the first step of denying Christian existence in the first place?
So I shared that vignette from my research to give you a sense of what sort of assumptions I brought to my research, right? As someone primarily educated in the West and in my reading of an interdisciplinary scholarship that constantly and for many years persuasively argued that state regulation inhibits religious freedom or the flourishing of religious communities. I found, in fact, in my research, that the regulation of communal life was supported by minority groups, not just Copts, but also Baha'i. Right? And the issue for them was not the state's regulation, right, or the state's authority, but its unwillingness to recognize their truth, right? So I'm not sure how helpful it would be to describe or discuss or imagine a hypothetical situation, because I find, and I detail this at great length in my book, that every community has traditions of regulation, right, and conventions through which they regulate who belongs, right, and who doesn't. So for Copts, this includes martyrologies, right, where devotion to the father is considered sacred, right? We talked about Abu Sayfain and Dimyana and the significance of these martyrologies in the Coptic tradition and Coptic imagination and practice in Egypt today. And there are ways that communities beyond the state also demarcate their difference, right? We can talk about naming practices. We can talk about as-salib, right, which is different from washm, right? There are these ordinary, really local ways that people distinguish themselves from others that are communally significant. What I'm saying is, what I'm trying to draw our attention to is that regulation is not a merely top-down phenomenon, but there is alignment, right? There's alignment between communities and the state that helps us understand why the Khanat al-Diyana, right, the religion box is still on ID cards, because it's significant for Egyptians to be understood as different from one another, and yet still Egyptian, right? That's why one can be Copt and Egyptian. Of course, this is synonymous, right, for many Copts. Muslim and Egyptian, Baha'i, but you cannot not have a religion, right? You cannot not have a religious affiliation. That tends to be the case in Egypt.
Yeah. I think, thank you for your answer. And I really wish we had more time to take more questions, or that I didn't just talk at all so I could ask more questions. But thank you all so much for your contribution. I really appreciate it. I hope this panel was insightful for everyone. Thank you.
Thank you.